Aloha everyone, and welcome to the last lecture of this first unit of material. Today we are going to cover chapter 23, which is all about global climate change. This is a topic that you have without a doubt heard a lot about in the news, and you can see on the screen, I just kind of put a small sampling of news articles related to climate change. And this is going to be an issue you're going to hear more and more about as time goes on. And you probably have people in your life, or maybe you yourself, maybe you're not sure about climate change. Maybe in the past you tried to understand climate change or wanted more information, but it's just become so politicized that you just weren't sure how to get reliable information that you might be able to share with others about climate change. So hopefully today you'll get some reliable information, and really regardless your stance on climate change, today we are going to learn more about it. And hopefully by the end of this lecture you will have a better understanding of climate change and what you yourself can do to decrease your carbon footprint. For our learning objectives for chapter 23, first of all, we're going to learn about some of the ways that changing temperature and changing climate can impact ecosystem. So we're going to look at some of the effects of climate change. Then we're going to look at what is the greenhouse effect and what exactly does it have to do with global warming, which is another term you've probably heard before. Then we're going to look at how does carbon cycle or move through ecosystems, and how are humans impacting, how are we adding to and changing that carbon cycle. And finally, we're going to look at the difference between renewable and non-renewable resources. And then we'll kind of end by looking at how climate change is impacting Hawaii, and also what you yourselves can do to try to reduce your carbon footprint. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm sure at some point in your education you have covered the difference between weather and climate. But just as a little bit of a refresher here, weather is your short-term atmospheric conditions. So weather describes things like the temperature, precipitation, and other types of data at a specific point in time. Weather data can include hourly descriptions or daily descriptions of the local temperature, whether there is precipitation, what the chance of precipitation is, what the UV index is, how much cloud cover, is it partly cloudy, is it mostly cloudy, is it sunny, what the percent humidity is, the air pressure, wind speed, storm variables. We could go on and on. There are a lot of different things that can tell us the weather. Again, that's conditions at a specific point in time. Weather differs though from climate. And climate is long-term regional averages that describe many weather data points. I like to tell students, think about like 30-year stretches of time, and that's your climate. Whereas weather, it's short-term, hourly, daily basis. So climate requires very careful calculation because you have to put together all that weather data, right? Climate data includes yearly or longer, so 30-year time span, averages of temperature, precipitation, solar radiation, air pressure, wind speed, all those variables again. So putting those all together. So that's a lot of data that has to be processed. Climate is regulated through some very complex interactions that occur among the sun, the earth, the ocean, and the atmosphere. And climate can vary both regionally, which we looked at a little bit last lecture when we looked at the different biomes and how we get different biomes due to the temperature, how the earth, how much solar radiation the earth is receiving. That kind of determines the biomes, right? As well as the precipitation that occurs there. So climate varies regionally, and it also varies seasonally. Not something that we see much in Hawaii besides having our dry and wet seasons, but many other parts of the globe see very distinct seasons throughout the year. So here in this figure, you can see weather, short-term state of the atmosphere. So if I was to tell you that it is 80 degrees Fahrenheit in Honolulu today, that is the weather. Climate gives us an idea of the long-term pattern of weather. So tropical climate, or just knowing that maybe you're going to the desert, that's probably going to be dry and hot, right? So that is climate. This is the average weather over many years, like I said, about 30 years in one place. Now that we know the difference between weather and climate, what exactly is this whole chapter about? What is climate change? Well, climate change is when there is a change or a variation in a climate over an extended period of time. In other words, climate change includes major changes in temperature, precipitation, or wind patterns, among other effects that occur over several decades or longer. Global warming is another term, like I said, that you've probably heard before. This is a major cause of current climate change. So global warming refers to the recent and ongoing rise in global average temperatures near Earth's surface. This is caused, as we'll learn a little later in this lecture, by increasing concentrations of greenhouse gases. But something I want you to note is that many times students will use these two terms, even supposedly experts will use these two terms interchangeably, and that's not the way that they should be used. Global warming is only one aspect of climate change. So these are not synonymous terms. Global warming is one part of climate change. Climate change also includes sea level rise. It includes ocean acidification. It includes coral bleaching. There are many different parts to climate change, and global warming is just one of those. So for example, when we look at climate change, one thing that we're seeing is changes in average temperatures. These changes in average temperatures are causing a change in the seasonal behavior of plants and animals. So changes in, for example, average spring temperatures result in earlier flowering dates in some locations and then later flowering dates in other locations. So if you look at this figure here, what you're going to notice is this came from your book as well. But over here is your rate of temperature change from 1901 to 2015, so a long time period, right? And the areas that are in blue, that means they have gotten colder. So these are your decreasing temperatures, mainly in the southeast here. And then those areas in red mean they've gotten warmer. So that's the majority of the United States, right? Then if you look over here, this shows you the change in first bloom date between 1951 to 1960 and 2006 to 2015. So you can see the areas that have increasing temperatures. That means, obviously, because the temperature is increasing sooner, you're going to see flowering plants bloom sooner. These areas down here that saw decreasing temperatures, well, that also means they're going to see later bloom dates, right? So there is a correlation between the temperature and the bloom time. And a lot of different species are affected by these bloom dates. A term that is introduced in your book is phenology. This is the study of nature's interlinked rhythms, or in other words, of the cyclic life events in nature. And this can include timing of reproductive cycles. This can include timing of migration. And as we talked about in the last slide, it can include the timing of blooming flowers. Climate change is making it really difficult for scientists to predict ecosystem effects. So we just talked about how spring temperatures in many places in the United States and throughout the world have risen over the past 25 years, and plants have begun to flower earlier. However, if we look at an example of what this might affect, because maybe you're wondering, well, why do we care that much about bloom dates? Like, they're going to be pretty whenever they bloom, right? Well, the problem is that animals have not synced their timelines to this earlier bloom. And one really good example of this is roe deer. So over here you can see kind of this example from your book. So you may have already kind of seen this or at least glanced over it, but just to explain it a little bit better, hopefully. Roe deer try to kind of time their birth around the time of blooming because then there is food for the baby roe deer to eat. So here you see average spring temperature. The temperature goes up. That leads to the flowering date happening sooner. But there is a mismatch here because the roe deer have not changed their birthing cycle. So now the roe deer are being born and they don't have the food availability that they should. So roe deer birth has not changed enough to compensate for the changing schedule of the blooms. And this is associated actually with the decline in the survival of young roe deer. Scientists have actually been studying these roe deer and their ecosystem for nearly 30 years. Warmer springs have made the preferred food for the deer, like I said, available earlier, these flowering plants, but the deer have not shifted their birthing dates to match up with the food availability. And in this particular case, the deer population is being negatively impacted. And you can see that here with the juvenile survival, right? So this is the proportion of each of the fawns that survived to the onset of winter. And it has decreased substantially with the mismatch of days, this mismatch being between the bloom time in the spring and the birth of the baby or the fawn roe deer. So just one of probably many examples where we're seeing climate change really impact things at an ecosystem level. There are many other examples that you can find in the literature, and also there are probably many examples that we as scientists aren't even aware of yet. Another example looking at the effects of climate change is that with increased air temperatures, this tends to be linked with an increased prevalence of disease. So infectious diseases are occurring across broader ranges in response to environmental changes that are associated with climate change. Air and water temperatures have increased and the warm seasons tend to be longer. And with this change in climate, what we've seen is that insect populations have been able to spread. And those insects a lot of times spread infectious diseases, and those infectious microbes have actually expanded into new territory that used to not be warm enough for them, but now is. And these changes have brought a whole new level of concern about the health impacts even of climate change. One of the examples, these two figures are actually from your book. This first one here talks about the increase in tick prevalence. And ticks, especially the deer ticks, can carry Lyme disease, right? Lyme disease is caused by a bacterium and that it is transmitted through the bite of deer ticks. Due to the increase in global air temperatures, the deer tick populations have increased and they have expanded into new territories. This has correlated with an increase in Lyme disease as well. So you can kind of see that here. This shows you the reported distribution of the deer tick in 1996 versus 2016. Look at this northward expansion because it's not as cold as it was before. It's now warm enough for those ticks to survive. Then the reported cases of Lyme disease 2001 to 2015. Again, more prevalent and more of a northward expansion as well. And one of the problems here that we're seeing is that winters in some areas have been milder, maybe not having a freeze or a very long freeze, and so these ticks are actually surviving through the winter when they usually would have been killed off. Another example that's kind of near and dear to me because I studied oysters for my PhD dissertation is that increased water temperatures have been correlated to an increase in some diseases. One of these being the flesh-eating bacterium Vibrio. And this is transmitted by contact with contaminated shellfish such as oysters. Oysters are a big culprit of this because the way that they feed is they filter feed the water, right? The water goes in through their gills, they collect the particles from it for their food source, and then eject the water back out. So they are trapping everything in the water, including this Vibrio bacterium. And due to an increase in global water temperatures, we're seeing that these Vibrio infections are occurring more frequently in northern locations that we didn't used to see them. And this expansion is predicted just to continue. So you can see here the annual incidence of confirmed Vibrio infections in the United States. So confirmed infections is on the y-axis, year is on the x-axis. You can see this increasing trend. And I wish that all these figures in your e-text would have trend lines. So that line that you kind of fit to the data, it's called like a line of best fit, because you would see kind of this increasing trend line here. And that's what we as scientists kind of look at, right? Is the overall trend increasing? Is it just random? Are we not really seeing a trend at all? Over here, I put a figure that's not in your text, and it also looks at rising temperatures and disease outbreaks. So you can see that rising temperature has definitely made a lot of diseases much worse, right? You can also see other things that are related to the climate change issues that we're seeing that have made disease worse. So having less rainfall or having more rainfall, having floods, having drought, storms, ocean climate change, fires, heat waves, sea level rise. So all of those different parts of climate change have been leading to an increase in the number of diseases. So yet another big effect of climate change. Another example of an effect of climate change is that climate change can even have kind of these cascading effects for entire ecosystems. Organisms such as bark beetles, you can see these bark beetles right here, they have expanded their range northward, and this has resulted in the widespread death of many trees. So these bark beetles used to be kept in check, and the way that they were kept in check is that freezing winters would kill them off, right? So freezing temperatures. And also what trees would do is they would produce sap to just smother the bark beetles, and that would keep them in check as well. The problem now is, one, it's warmer, so these freezing temperatures aren't killing them off, and two, trees are being threatened by a lot of different things. They're having to deal with changing temperatures, changes in precipitation, and they're having to deal with fires. So these trees are stressed, and they are unable to release and make that sap to kill off the beetles in order to defend themselves. So dead trees, drought, high temperatures, these bark beetles, these all contribute to problems that we're seeing with trees, and they can lead to severe wildfires. So we see more frequent and extreme wildfires, which we'll look at in the next slide as well. We see more frequent and extreme drought. There is a quicker loss of moisture from the soil due to the higher temperatures, and reduced defenses of trees against bark beetles, right? Because these trees are under threat, so they're not able to produce the sap that they need to defend themselves. As I alluded to on the previous slide, another big issue with climate change is wildfires. There were extreme wildfire events that have affected many different ecosystems. We've heard about them in the United States and California. Recently, there were some big issues in Wyoming as well. And back in 2019, kind of before the whole pandemic hit, there were also millions of acres that were burned in Australia as well. I don't know if you remember, there was severe bleaching before that on the Great Barrier Reef. Then the wildfires happened, and then there was more coral bleaching, and it just felt like Australia was getting hit over and over again by these issues dealing with climate change. So on the left here, what you see is kind of how climate change impacts wildfires. So as the temperatures grow hotter, the air becomes drier, right? That allows wildfires to occur more frequently. You're not going to see wildfires if there's really moist air, right? But if there's dry air, these wildfires are able to burn bigger and hotter. And this happens because as the winter in the western United States ends sooner, and we're seeing less snow during the winter, that means that the spring and summer snow melt produces less water. And less surface and groundwater is going to lead to the soil drying out. It makes plants more vulnerable, and it increases the likelihood that a fire will start and then spread to surrounding vegetation. Over here on the right, you see data, and this is actually from a Monitoring Trends in Burn Severity program. And this looks at large fires in the United States, large being defined as greater than 500 acres for the eastern United States, or greater than 1,000 acres for the western United States, obviously because western United States we generally see larger forests. And it does not include the prescribed burns that are done to try to clear areas and manage the forests. So you can see here, this one actually does have a trend line, right? So the number of wildfires per year is on the y-axis. X-axis is from 1985 to 2015. And you can see this very clear trend line showing you that we have an increasing number of wildfires. One of the problems is that this issue has become politicized as well. I don't know a single scientist that would tell you that climate change never should have been a political issue to begin with. It shouldn't be, but there's money involved, right? There's money for grants, money to try to deal with climate change. So whenever there's money involved, it seems like politics also get involved. Same thing here with wildfires. A lot of money to try to fight these wildfires, try to prevent them, manage them, and it has become a political issue as well. So you'll see some people that are saying that, oh, these wildfires are not due to climate change, they are due to poor forest management. Other people are saying, no, they are due completely to climate change. And the reality is it's some of both. Both of these things are true, right? Could we manage forests better? Yes. Is it hard to manage the forests really well when you don't know what the climate's going to do because of climate change and you're seeing all these issues come up that you haven't seen in past years? Yes. So both of those things are true in terms of why we're seeing all of these wildfires. So I really encourage you, I know that it's really discouraging sometimes. This whole lecture probably seems a little bit like doom and gloom. I actually teach an upper level marine conservation course, and that whole class sometimes just seems depressing because it's really hard to talk about conservation and try to keep a positive light with everything that's going on around us, right? It probably seems a lot like doom and gloom when you talk about climate change, but there still is hope. There are things that we can do, which we'll talk about at the end of this lecture, but I really encourage you to, choose wisely the information that you decide to read. If you turn on your TV and watch the news to get information about climate change, it's probably not going to be super reliable. If you go and find a peer-reviewed article, it's probably a little more likely that that's reliable. So make sure that your sources of information are not trying to sway voters one way or another. Don't make it a political thing. Try to stick just to the facts. Next, we're going to kind of switch gears a little bit. We're going to move from talking about the effects of climate change to looking at the greenhouse effect. The greenhouse effect is probably something you've heard of. It is actually a natural process that helps to maintain steady and life-sustaining surface temperatures on Earth. So in other words, the greenhouse effect is a good thing, right? Without the greenhouse effect, Earth would be uninhabitable for us. It would be too cold. We need the greenhouse effect. What happens with the greenhouse effect is shown pretty well in this figure here. So the sun, you're going to see sunlight hits the Earth's surface, right? And then the heat radiates back out to the atmosphere. So some of this heat is going to escape to space. There are, however, certain gases here in Earth's atmosphere known as greenhouse gases that are going to trap the heat within the atmosphere. And this trapped heat warms the atmosphere as well as Earth's surface. So again, this is technically a good thing, right? We want the Earth to be habitable, right? We want that steady, life-sustaining surface temperature. The primary greenhouse gases that absorb the radiation are going to be things like methane, carbon dioxide, and nitrous oxide. These greenhouse gases can be naturally occurring. So for example, when there's a volcanic eruption, you're going to see some greenhouse gases released in that. But you can also have anthropogenically produced or human-produced greenhouse gases. So these are produced by agriculture, the burning of fossil fuels, slash and burn techniques in order to clear trees, right? Those also produce a lot of greenhouse gases. So we'll look kind of on the next slide at how we have changed this basic greenhouse effect, which is technically a good thing, how we've changed it to kind of make it a bad thing. So over here you see that greenhouse effect that we just talked about, right? The natural, good greenhouse effect that keeps Earth habitable for us, right? Keeps the temperature stable, life-sustaining. Over here you see the human-enhanced greenhouse effect. So since the Industrial Revolution, the greenhouse effect has been magnified due to greenhouse gases being emitted into the atmosphere by humans. So as humans emit more and more greenhouse gases, and as those gases are trapped in the atmosphere, more heat is going to be retained in the atmosphere. And this causes an average warming across the globe. So you can see here how you have this little layer here of greenhouse gases, your carbon dioxide, your methane, your nitrous oxide. Over here, it's much thicker, right? Much bigger, much more of these greenhouse gases, and that leads to warmer temperatures across the globe. So that learning objective that talked about, how can we relate the greenhouse effect and global warming? Well, the greenhouse effect, our natural good thing, because we are producing and releasing more greenhouse gases, those greenhouse gases are being trapped here, right? And because we have all that heat trapped here, all these greenhouse gases, it leads to global warming, right? Or an increase in the temperatures. And here is another figure from your book. So this one kind of put together temperatures and carbon dioxide, which carbon dioxide is the greenhouse gas that you will probably hear the most about. We probably have released the most amount of carbon dioxide out of all greenhouse gases. Another one you'll hear a lot about is methane, because methane is actually more potent of a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, but it's not talked quite a bit as much as carbon dioxide is. So what we've seen is that global carbon dioxide has increased over the course of industrialization. Global temperatures have followed suit, right? So long-term measurements of global temperatures and atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration show a very clear positive correlation, which you can see here. So on the x-axis is the year 1880 to 2020. The y-axis over here is the differences from the 20th century average temperature in degrees Celsius. So in other words, how much have we seen the temperature increase on this y1 axis? So that's going to be in blue, and over here in red. And then over here you see the carbon dioxide concentration in parts per million, which is going to be this black trend line here. So you can see temperatures we're, kind of variant. Still, we're not seeing anything in terms of a positive increase in temperature until about 1980-ish. And then they all started increasing, right? And then your atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration, you can clearly see, has increased over time. So carbon dioxide and temperature are linked. Some people would like to say that they're not. Many people would like to tell you that the earth just goes through cycles, or that every animal will just adapt because every animal has adapted in the past. But we'll see in a figure coming up that it's the rate of change that is just so problematic. And even if one species does adapt really well, that one species might be a predator of another organism, and it could completely wipe out that species just because it was able to adapt and this other species wasn't. So we're going to see a lot of big effects due to climate change. So if we look, the global temperatures during the 2015 to 2019 increased by 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit, or 0.98 degrees Celsius, from the average during 1951 to 1980. Now, this might not seem like very much, right? 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit might not seem like much to you, but it actually is a really big deal. The temperature change that occurred is variable across the world, right? Some parts of the world saw less increases or even temperature decreases. Other parts of the world saw greater increases than the 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. Current measurements suggest that the Arctic is actually warming faster than other parts of the Earth. And the term that your book uses to talk about this is Arctic amplification. So pretty much that is saying that the Arctic has actually warmed 2 times as much as other parts of the world. Arctic sea ice extent in 2019 was the second lowest on record, a 3-way tie with 2016 and 2007. So rising temperatures have caused the Arctic sea ice to melt and break apart earlier in the season, and a reduction in that extent of the summer sea ice in the Arctic results in even more heat absorbing into the ocean to be available to, so it results in more of the ocean being available to be hit by solar radiation. Probably some of the first pictures that you saw of climate change were that picture of the polar bear sitting on this little sheet of ice, trapped, pretty much couldn't get anywhere because it was just on that tiny little piece of ice and looked like it was struggling for its life. So this has had a major impact on polar bears. So those images, yes, are to invoke emotional feelings from people, right? But it's actually reality. Climate change has had a huge impact on polar bears. For example, even Canadian polar bears, they weigh 55 pounds less than they did 30 years ago. And this really compromises their reproductive ability. Next, we're going to move on to our third learning objective, looking at the carbon cycle and how carbon kind of moves and cycles through the Earth. So the carbon cycle is the movement of carbon atoms between organic, meaning living, and inorganic, so I should clarify that. Organic means that it has carbon in it, right? Inorganic would mean that it doesn't have carbon. But in order to be living, you must have carbon, so that's why I kind of said it that way. But technically, organic and inorganic molecules in the environment. So plants absorb carbon dioxide and convert it into solid forms. Organisms can return some carbon into the atmosphere. Other carbon is going to be buried, fossilized, and then converted into our fossil fuels. So things like coal, oil, and gas over very long timescales. So we talked already about the carbon cycle. I showed you a picture of the marine kind of example of the carbon cycle in our previous lecture. So I'm not going to talk too much about this again because I did already introduce it to you last chapter. But your book brings up the carbon cycle in this chapter, and it talks about kind of the amount of carbon dioxide that's produced from natural processes and the amount that is absorbed through photosynthesis are pretty similar. So carbon dioxide produced by human activity is what has kind of led to this net increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide. So there are natural processes that we'll talk about later in the semester, kind of coming up in terms of photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is where plants are going to take carbon dioxide and they convert that into energy for themselves, sugar, and release oxygen as the byproduct, which we then use because without that oxygen we could not breathe, we could not live, right? And we do the process of respiration, where we're then releasing CO2. The plants then take it, so it makes kind of a nice cycle. That's what this is showing here, right? Photosynthesis and respiration cycle. So photosynthesis, respiration, and decomposition are responsible for most of the carbon cycling. Since the late 1700s, human activities such as burning fossil fuels and deforestation have made really significant contributions to the carbon cycle. At this point, you might be wondering, okay, how do we even know how much carbon dioxide there is? How do we measure CO2? So it's said that the carbon dioxide concentration is the highest that it has been in 800,000 years. And we know this because we're able to measure historical levels looking at gas bubbles that are actually trapped in Antarctic ice. And we can use modern levels that are measured directly from the air. So in terms of using these ice cores, actually a lab that I was at for a year, there were a couple of scientists that this was their work. They went down to Antarctica and they actually took out ice cores, brought them back, and they would section them. Kind of like what you see in this picture, you can take sections throughout that ice core. So up here, this is 2020, down here is 1750. So you can take distinct measurements throughout that ice core. You can look at the concentration of carbon dioxide, the little bubbles in those ice cores, to know what that concentration of carbon dioxide was. So you can kind of see in here, it's talking a little bit, it shows you some of the major events that kind of occurred. And then it shows you up here, 2016, carbon dioxide concentrations in Antarctica reached 400 parts per million, nearly 1.5 times greater than pre-industrial levels. So these ice cores are how we know what carbon dioxide used to be and what it is now. The way that we know what it is now, well, this is, something that we all probably have seen or at least heard of. The way that we measure current carbon dioxide concentrations is actually via a meter that is up on Mauna Loa, right? So on the big island of Hawaii. So that's how we measure current concentrations, right? We're getting them directly from the air, and actually a lot of the world uses those levels that are recorded on the big island. And I would say that this is probably the infamous figure, right? So this is the one you see a lot of times from the IUCN, many other organizations. This shows you your carbon dioxide in parts per million on the y-axis. X-axis is your thousands of years before today. And this little line right here, pretty much it's saying, carbon dioxide had never been above this for millennia. So the people that say that, oh, we're just going through cycles, no big deal, the reality is we've never been here. This is not a cycle. We haven't been at this level before. So we've seen highs, we've seen lows, nothing like this. This is not a cycle. This is a human-induced change. So you can see ice core data in the orange, so till about 1958, and that's when you see the modern instrumental data, measuring it right out of the air in red, and that shows us our levels. Even in the ice cores, we've seen big increases, right? 400 parts per million. So I told you that in 2016 in Antarctica is when we saw 400 parts per million. That puts you out right here. That was in 2016 in Antarctica. So it doesn't matter what type of, whether you're using ice cores or current instrumentation, we're seeing the same kind of increase in that carbon dioxide concentration. And the other thing that's a big deal is this rate of change, right? Look how quickly we're seeing that increase occurring. That's another thing that's going to be really hard for animals to adapt to. Your book then kind of brings up this point of carbon footprint, and you're actually going to be calculating your ecological footprint in the class activity on Lolima for this week. But your carbon footprint is a measure of how much carbon we are responsible for emitting into the atmosphere. So there are a variety of human activities that are increasing the levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Power generation, land use related activities like slash and burn agriculture, right? Industry, transportation, all of those things result in really high greenhouse gas emissions. Burning fossil fuels and many other human activities are emitting greenhouse gas. You can see this pie chart kind of shows you some of the big culprits. So electricity and heat production, agriculture and other land use, industry is a big deal. Even like your book talked about, rice and cattle can result in a lot of methane production. So that's not even CO2, but that's another type of greenhouse gas that is actually more potent and can be more damaging. So pretty much we as humans have increased these greenhouse gases substantially. And your carbon footprint is how much carbon are you responsible for emitting, right? And so that can also be kind of synonymous with the term ecological footprint, which you'll be calculating in an activity this week. The last learning objective for this lecture was to kind of understand the difference between non-renewable and renewable resources. And I think this is something that you probably have a grasp on. But just to review, non-renewable resources, this means they are not replenished at the same rate that they are being produced, right? So we can use up gas and oil pretty quickly, but it takes thousands to millions of years to regenerate that, right? So that is a non-renewable resource. These non-renewable resources are pretty cheap and they're abundant. And some problems with them, though, is that extracting them can be very damaging to ecosystems. Think about drilling in the bottom of the ocean, right? That's very damaging. Drilling in many areas is very damaging, right? Burning non-renewable resources is also a problem because it contributes to climate change and even health problems. Renewable resources, on the other hand, can be easily replenished. So that may make you wonder, okay, if these can be easily replenished, like what are we thinking? Why are we not just using these? Well, they're more expensive and they're not as widely used, mainly because we just don't have very efficient technology in some cases in order to make them easy to use and inexpensive. These renewable resources cause less or in some cases no carbon dioxide to be released. However, they're not perfect. So in some cases, installing them and producing them can actually be damaging to environments. One example I can think of this, the Johnson Atoll area is actually a place where we see a lot of really important minerals that can actually be used in electric car batteries, right? So that area really isn't an area that I think we should be deep sea mining. I'm not sure we should be deep sea mining anywhere personally as a marine biologist, but especially not in that region. And we have to get those minerals for these car batteries somewhere, right? And that's one place they're abundant. So that's kind of just to give you an example of one issue with getting this renewable technology, sometimes we have to damage areas in order to get pieces to put it all together. So use of renewable resources in the United States is still a very small portion of the total energy that we use, but it is increasing quickly. Hopefully with time we become better at using renewable resources. I mean, nothing's perfect, right? So the reality is that an electric car still needs electricity to charge it, right? And how do you make electricity? Does it magically come out of the air? No, right? So you have some greenhouse gases being emitted that way too, right? So it's kind of one of those things, we still have a ways to go at kind of perfecting our use of renewable resources. There are some areas in the world that are probably like, climate change, okay, it's a little hotter now, a little less hot here. Ocean's clear over there, like thousands of miles away, so I don't care about sea level rise or ocean acidification or any of that stuff. Like, even then, I'm like, wow, okay, maybe should be thinking about those things anyway. But I feel like here on the islands, we are going to be, and already have been, really affected by climate change, right? And as I said, climate change has a lot of different aspects to it. And we're seeing some of these aspects on the Hawaiian Islands. So this is just showing you here, this is from the Pacific Island Ocean Observing System, or PAC-IOOS. This is a really cool free resource that you can actually use. So I use this for one of my labs that I do for Hawaiian environmental biology for UH West Oahu. And it's really cool because you can pinpoint specific areas, you can look at some of the climate change effects in various parts of the islands, various parts of the Pacific. So we're not just seeing, higher temperatures and less rainfall. Those are things we're seeing, right? Hawaii has seen an overall decline in rainfall in the last 30 years. It varies based on the different parts of the islands, right? Because you have some that are getting a lot of precipitation because they're on the windward side, right? And then the leeward side over here in Kapolei, we're getting less rainfall. But overall, there's been a decline in the rainfall. There's also been warming air temperature. So the rate of warming air temperature has actually quadrupled in the past 40 years in the Hawaiian Islands to over 0.3 degrees Fahrenheit per decade. Global ocean acidity or acidification has increased by 30% due to the marine uptake of carbon dioxide. So many people like to dismiss the ocean. The ocean is actually our best bet in some cases of trying to sustain this increased amount of carbon dioxide, because essentially the ocean is a carbon dioxide sink, right? It's absorbing a lot of that CO2, helping us through this current situation, but it can only do so much, right? And now we're seeing some effects of that with ocean acidification. And this can cause a lot of issues with corals, shellfish, and plankton. Sea level rise, I think, is one that you can visibly see just driving around Oahu, right? Think of all the areas, especially like the northeast corner of the island, where literally it's like you're about to fall into the ocean, right? You have just this little barrier of rocks, because there's been a lot of erosion, and the sea level has risen. So sea level rise has risen over the last century on each island at rates that vary from 0.5 to 1.3 inches per decade. So this has contributed to shoreline recession, right? That erosion. We're seeing very accelerated rates of sea level rise on the islands as well as globally, right? So sea level rise causes more flooding in coastal areas, right? It causes erosion, causes other hazards that can degrade our coastal ecosystems, lead to beach loss. Think of Waikiki. Think of all the sandbags you see there trying to keep the beach that is left. This infographic kind of shows you potential economic loss and the sea level rise that is kind of occurring here. So you're going to see this whole Waikiki area gone. But you're going to see more than that. There's a lot of other areas that's going to move in further than just Waikiki, right? So this is just showing you economic loss. But with this sea level rise, as it increases, you're going to see more and more of these amazing islands just being inundated by seawater. So definitely we can visibly see some of these climate change effects in the Hawaiian Islands. At this point, I feel like I need to apologize because this has been a lot of doom and gloom, right? But I think that it is better to be knowledgeable and, be upset by the knowledge that you gain and want to do something about it rather than to be ignorant. So that's why I hope I leave you with in a little bit of a way that, hey, at least now you know, if you didn't already, you have some actual hard and fast data that you can show others, that you can hopefully yourself kind of see, okay, this makes a little more sense to me. But now I also want to tell you what you can do. So what can you do to reduce your carbon footprint? There are many simple things that you can do. Some of them will actually save you money too, which everybody likes to save money, right? Because you can save water and electricity, so that's going to make that water and, oh my, the electricity bill in the Hawaiian Islands, right? That's always very high. So ways to help you save on those and help out the environment, that's like a win-win situation. So one of the big things here is vampire energy. So even if stuff is plugged in and you're not using it, it's still sucking out energy, right? That's about 5 to 8% of a single family's household use of electricity. So unplug everything, take everything out of those sockets. Conserve your water, right? So baths, showers, if you're not using the water, say that you are washing your hair and you're not using the water, turn it off really quickly, turn it back on. Or do you really need to take a 20-minute shower? Could you just take a 10-minute shower? Things like that. Installing long-lasting light bulbs, that's going to save you on your electric bill as well. Choosing sustainable seafood, I think this is a big one. In Hawaii, there is actually, it's called Seafood Watch. It is a free app. Download it on your phone. Anytime you go to a restaurant, say that you like seafood, you can look and see if what is being served at that restaurant is sustainable. It can help you make good choices. It's not going to cost you anything, right? It's a free app on your phone. Download it if you're a seafood eater. Educating yourself, which is something you're already doing. So you've already checked that one off the box. Trying to use more fuel efficient means, taking mass transport when you can. I know it's not the greatest on island, but say you go visit other places, trying to be conscious of that as well, trying to use mass transport when available, volunteering to help. This is something that you're doing with your service learning. And I hope it's something that you'll continue to do even after this class. Maybe you'll find like your little niche or like something that you're like, wow, I really could care less about science, but this is really cool. Many of you, especially being natives on island, like you may find that it's just connects you to your culture and you really enjoy doing some of these service learning opportunities. Some of you have even contacted me saying you've been doing service learning. Can you keep doing that? And yes, of course, like that is great. I'm so happy to hear that. So many different things that you can do to kind of help reduce your carbon footprint. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this summary slide because I talked way more than I wanted to already. I just get kind of fired up about different things, and so I apologize for that. So I'm going to kind of keep this one short. So some ways that changing temperatures, changing climate has impacted ecosystems. We saw examples, right? Increased diseases, increased wildfires, increase in those bark beetles. We see a mismatch in timing of blooms and reproductive cycles, right? Greenhouse effect, right? That is that natural process where the heat radiated from the Earth's surface. We see some of that being absorbed by greenhouse gases. And that has to do with global warming because an increase in the amount of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases causes an increase of that warm air being trapped, right? So more greenhouse gases means we're trapping more of that heat, increasing Earth's temperature. The carbon is cycling through the ecosystem, so we see a lot of that. Like I talked about, most of this is naturally done through the processes of photosynthesis, respiration, and decomposition. And we're impacting the carbon cycle by releasing a lot of carbon dioxide, other forms of carbon. So I didn't point it out in that diagram of the carbon cycle, but what we're essentially doing is we're taking everything that's been stored down the earth, all those fossil fuels, that is a stored form of carbon dioxide, hasn't been impacting the earth, and then we're taking and unearthing it, right? We're releasing all of that to the atmosphere. And then the difference between renewable and non-renewable. Renewable is we can replenish it really quickly. Non-renewable, we cannot. So that concludes our lecture on chapter 23. If you haven't already, please make sure that you read your e-text, chapter 23, at least skim it in there, and then complete chapter 23 adaptive quiz. We also have a class assignment this week, class assignment number 3, and this has some questions to review the greenhouse effect and to look at how different things really contribute to greenhouse gas levels. You're also going to be able to calculate your ecological footprint and then look at ways that maybe you can try to reduce it. So this is definitely one way that we're taking this biology class and bringing it into our everyday lives. Then this is the end of unit number 1. So make sure that you are reviewing for the exam. You have a study guide through the Macmillan website, so check out that study guide. It just kind of gives you some ideas of what to study. Again, if it was in the text and we didn't cover it in our lectures, then you don't need to worry about it. But make sure you start reviewing, look at the red bolded vocab words in all my slides. That's a good place to start learning the vocab and then applying that to learning the different concepts. That's all I have for this lecture. Mahalo for watching.